Is God initially in his direction to Moses is telling him what he needs to build, the structure that he needs to build so that God can come dwell with his people. What we're talking about is what is called in the Old Testament the Tabernacle. Let's kind of talk together about three things, three kind of takeaways of the Tabernacle. What are implications of the fact that God has asked them to build this thing? And how does that make sense to us today? The first implication that I think is truly significant is that God is going to dwell with them. Now you say, duh, that's the whole point, isn't it? And I say, yeah, but we so easily just kind of breeze past that truth. We take it for granted because that's who God is. And we take it to granted at our own peril, is what I want you to know. That is that this should stun us to the core, that the God of the universe, the creator of all things, is going to come live in this with his people. The story of the people of God falling into disrepair is not coincidental. It is not by happenstance. It always begins with taking God for granted. The grace and the mercy and the rescuing power of God taken for granted, and therefore we just kind of live however we want. But I would say to you, the grace and the mercy of a God who has seen your life up to this point, who knows all that you're capable of in this moment, good and bad, and, oh, by the way, who's seen how the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of your life are going to go, looks you in the eyes and says, this is still my heart's desire for you, that I would come and dwell right where you are. Second implication of this tabernacle idea of what God is proposing here is what I would say is that God is establishing a kingdom. Right? Now, kingdom is hard for us to understand in our modern world. Sure, Prince Charles was just coronated as king, but even in England and most places today, those things are very much ceremonial. And so we kind of don't understand how kingdoms and royal realities work. But in essence, in the ancient world in which this was being written, the idea of a kingdom was a permanent and a singular rule, right? And it was led by a claim on a people and a territory by a sovereign, right? By a king or a queen, a prince or a princess, or however the structure was set up. And I think what actually is happening here, now it's kind of hard to see because you're like, this is a kingdom? Yeah, it actually is. That God has actually claimed a people, and he's claiming a land, and when he's doing it, he's actually claiming the whole earth. For way too long, the church has emphasized we need to get out of earth to get to heaven. But if you read the Bible correctly, it is full of God's desire to get heaven to earth. Now, I'm not suggesting to you being in heaven wouldn't be far greater than being on earth, but we have a mission, and we're part of this. And this is what's happening in this imagery. But it's more significant because, in essence, what God is saying to the people is, hey, when we're covenanting together, what we're actually doing is we're covenanting together in the restoration of all things. Do you see it? That this rescue of you from Egypt wasn't just, hey, a one-time cool rescue and redemption I was going to do. No, you've been rescued for something, so that on the basis of this rescue, I can continue to rescue and redeem all of the earth. My footstool is here. I've got my foot. I've taken a piece of ground, and it's going to expand as we together live this covenant relationship before all of the world. That ultimately, the hope of God, right, and the hope of the people is meant to be that all of the nations would see this covenant relationship and would see this different way of living and would see heaven meeting earth and themselves would become enveloped in it. This is mission. God is on the move to restore the whole earth, and he's calling his people into it. And from that, we get the third and final implication that I want to share with you this morning. That is that we and they, back then, have a role to play. Right? You've already been through the whole book of Genesis. And how does Genesis start? It starts with God creating things, right? And God is creating things in a pretty miraculous way. Do you remember? He speaks them into existence. Right? Theologians call it ex nihilo, out of nothing. Speaks them into existence. Now it's time for him to build this holy house, this reclamation project for all of the world. Wouldn't it be a wonderful time for him once again to go Genesis 1 and 2 on us and speak some stuff right into existence? But it doesn't happen that way, does it? He says to Moses, you guys are going to build me a dwelling. We should not overlook that. This is significant. It is to be wholly occupied, right? And I don't mean wholly like entire, I mean Holy, like divine purity. God is going to live in it. But it is to be human constructed. Pretty significant. And we ask ourselves, why? Because God is calling all of creation into this restoration project. And the tabernacle is a microcosm of the bigger mission that God has given his people. So you have, in God calling his people to build a tabernacle, three distinct truths that I would suggest to you are just as relevant today as they were way back when this thing was first built. Truth number one, God desires to dwell with his people. That is no different today than it was then. Truth number two, God is building his kingdom, and we're meant to be part of it. No different today than it was then. Truth number three, we have a role to play in building this kingdom. Go all the way to verse 14, right? The Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelt among us. Some translations, because they know what they're saying, translate it this way. The Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. John is suggesting that Jesus is the once and for all fulfillment of the Old Testament tabernacle. Will God ever dwell with his people again? Yes, in Jesus. Mobile, moving God amongst his people. You get all the way to the end of John's gospel, and he wants to cement this truth of what God has done in Jesus. And so Jesus, in his death and in his resurrection, provides the forgiveness of God once and for all for the brokenness of the people, once again stunning us, shocking our hearts back into their right rhythm with the grace and the mercy of God in light of our utter brokenness and sinfulness. And then John gives us a very poignant picture of how the disciples meet the empty tomb of Jesus. John chapter 20. Mary Magdalene, right? She stood outside the tomb of Jesus crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. Hang on for that verse just a second, Jack. What's going on in this verse? Mary and the disciples, they've showed up to the tomb. They're looking in there. Jesus is nowhere to be found. What do they find instead? Where Jesus' body had been laid, there are two angels, one at the head and one at the foot, facing each other. Another way you could say angels is cherubim. What is this picture in John chapter 20? It's the Ark of the Covenant. Do you see it? The two angels at the head and the feet with their wings overspread, facing each other. The very thing that was holy, the place where heaven and earth intersected, now becomes fully realized in the resurrection that can once and for all bring life to all that was dead and damaged and decaying in this earth. that Jesus has done a dramatic thing. This Ark of the Covenant is no longer behind several curtains in a tent, a tabernacle, or a temple, nor is it buried behind a solid block of stone because of death. Instead, it is wide open for everyone. Where on earth now does heaven meet earth? Wherever you go. That is not to call you divine. You are not. But the divine is with you. This is mission, friends. Because tomorrow, your alarm will go off early on a Monday morning, just like mine, and you'll say, oh, really? But when you rise and go to your place of work, you provide an opportunity for those who are far from God to be close to Him. And when you help your kids get ready for another week of school, you do likewise. Do you see it? We have purpose. We have mission. We have calling in this world. So, on the basis of that, we are right to remember the opening verses of Exodus 25 and say, what then does that mean? Well, that means we have a role to play. So, we ought to give. This is not a sermon about giving money to the church. That's not at all what I'm talking about. Actually, I'm asking you to do something bigger. I'm asking you to give your life to the kingdom of God and the mission He's called us to. To work, which is sometimes pleasing and sometimes hard. To roll up your sleeves and get dirty doing the work of God in this world. But ultimately, to worship. To order your life around the presence of God with you in such a way that even those around you who may be far from God might take notice and themselves turn to God as well. Can I pray with you?